Didn't we talk about the bread of life last week? Right? Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And we are hearing this once again. We're picking up from verse 51, which is exactly where we left off last Sunday. And spoiler alert, we will have some overlap again next week from this week's reading. We began with the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. That's verse 1 and going on in the earlier part of chapter 6. Feeding the 5,000. And last week we compared the two grumbling communities of those in the Gospel of John, the scene that we're talking about, and the ancient community in the wilderness who God ended up providing manna because they were grumbling. Today's reading began with the promise that concluded last week's grumbling of the community, and that is, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. And we might wonder, why such repetition on that bread of life concept and theme for whole month of August? Because when we repeat something, it means there's something important that is being said. As our older child Noah is growing older, he figured out a way to avoid my repetition. What he will do is that when he's caught doing something wrong, he will admit his fault really fast and leave the site as quick as possible. So yesterday, he stepped over an electronic equipment in the house. He stepped on it. And we were telling him that he will break it and he shouldn't do that, right? He said, okay, really fast, and tried to change the topic by saying, can I go play outside? Now that I know that this is his pattern, I answered, yes, you can, and I followed him outside to finish the rest of my preaching, laying out all the possible consequences of his actions. I'm sure that I will appear in one of his nightmares. But when we repeat something, there's something that is important to be heard. With that in mind, that important thing here in today's scripture is the bread. It's the bread. For John, this is the communion story because John doesn't have the Last Supper story that we know of, that we're familiar with, that we recite every communion every month, where Jesus blesses the bread and the cup on the night before the crucifixion, that Passover meal. That doesn't exist. They do have the Passover meal, but foot washing is what's happening in John's Gospel, not the Last Supper. Or the communion piece. So instead, for John, this is when Jesus was standing before the hungry crowd of 5,000. Jesus took the 5 small barley loaves from the boy, gave thanks, and distributed to all. That's verse 11 of this same chapter. So we need to be able to visualize that this is on the very same day. All of this is happening on the same day, immediately after people experiencing the marvelous miracle of their hungry stomach being fed. That Jesus is explaining about the bread of life. That is not just temporary fulfillment, but an everlasting one. And we know this, we've heard this before, right? We heard about the bread of life so many times in our church life. And we join the communion table at least once a month, right? But it's nothing new. But as I was reflecting on the repetition of John chapter 6, I have to admit that there was part of me saying, maybe too much to preach the whole month on this. There's only so much we can talk about the bread. And I wondered, as we grow familiar with the stories As we grow familiar with the communion, as we grow familiar with the story about Jesus being baptized, familiar with the story about Jesus being crucified and resurrected, we as a culture might have been slowly drifting away from the goosebumps when we first heard about these stories. When we first heard about the bread of life. I think that's when repetition is needed, to be reminded of what it was all about from the beginning. I am currently serving the Asian and Pacific Islander Commission in our conference. And one of the recent things that we started is a monthly Zoom meeting with the gift of Zoom. We all started something Zoom, right? Monthly Zoom meeting for us to share our stories as Asian and Pacific Islanders in a safe environment around colleagues. It was in response to the realization of how ethnic pastors can be isolated in their journey in ministry, especially when they are not part of a specific ethnic group, or if that community doesn't exist in their community. So it was past Wednesday. So when it was my turn to share during that meeting, I shared how I've been feeling my limitations when I look back at my 7 years in Montpelier and how much of a part that I was in the community beyond the church walls. I was sharing about my limitations beyond the church walls. Within the church system, within these walls, or within my colleague pastors, or in some part of the community where my role as a pastor is known, like at the funeral home or at the wedding or whatever it is. It's totally fine. I'm loving it. But when I'm encountering anything else in the community, just as Yunki, no pastor, no anything, but just as Yunki, I feel this under the surface pushback towards the other. I feel it every time. And I was wondering how to overcome that if I need to model Christian evangelism or mission in this community. That's what I shared. I shared honestly with my confession of my limitations. So after I was done sharing, the Korean pastor who shared after me was joining us for the first time. It was first time for her to join us in this meeting. And she was a retired Asian woman clergy from our conference. And she shared that she came to the United States in 1962. And she was a pharmacist. And she got involved working with the Korean women who came to the U.S. And think about 1962 is right after Korean War. So Korean women who came to the U.S. who were also called the shadow women, because of their voices and identity lost, being utilized either for prostitution or whatever it is. She felt a strong call to be a voice for these women, so she went to seminary here to become a pastor to work with them. So she shared how she was hated by her first few appointments in her pastoral appointments because of her being Asian, not to say being a female clergy. One person from her congregation wrote a letter to the district superintendent, a complaint letter. And the phrase she shared with us in the meeting was something that I personally never heard before and never was described as before. And that parishioner said to the DS, how could you send us, and this is the expression that they used, an export from the Orient. How can you send us an export from an Orient? From the Orient. Not even from Korea, not even from Asia, but from the Orient. I never heard that. The point she was trying to make as she shared these stories, to tell me that those discriminations couldn't stop her couldn't stop her loving her people, those she served with. It couldn't stop her love for sharing Jesus Christ at the table with the people. That was the point that she was trying to encourage me as I was sharing mine. And I was reminded that's why my father, when I was thinking about that, my father, who was a missionary, was able to serve in Egypt for 15 years. Not because of the comfort of the living situation or because it offered good education for our children or had a promising retirement because if served in missionary, but because of that love towards Christ and for the people. That's it. That's it. That's the only thing they hung on to. And I was reminded of those missionaries from the United States, young missionaries. Those who came to Korea, they're not like experienced, seasoned 50, 60-year-old missionaries. They're like late teenagers, early 20s, right in college or right after college. They came to Asian countries to spread the gospel. Not because they knew a lot, but they knew one thing clearly, and that's the love of Jesus Christ. Despite all the threats and discrimination, I can't imagine they had to go through. They came. They went. So being in that meeting, sharing these stories, it really humbled me and gave me the opportunity to think about my own attitude to the community that I'm appointed to, the community of Montpelier. So I don't know, in the itinerant system in the United Methodist Church, we don't know as pastors how much longer my time will be at Trinity. It may be a year longer, it may be 2-3 more years from now, or it may be longer than that. We never know. But I commit to treasure each day, each Sunday, to be true to my love towards God and God's beloved people in this community. I commit myself to that simple truth. And I do have some experience under my belt after being here 7 years, enough to know that I will need to be smarter about how to do that more effectively and more strategic about how to be true to the missional call that we all have as followers of Christ. And I need your help in doing that. So when you were coming in, most of you got a pen, right? So as we enter into this post-quarantine church era, if we are to remember ourselves to be more missional in all we do, the first step for us is to discern where we are right now. So you've probably seen on the back of your bulletin, if you have a bulletin with you, or if you're worshiping online, when you visit a church's worship page, there was a pop-up screen that with this question. So I want you to answer. First two is pretty straightforward. The third question is the question that I want you to answer. If Trinity United Methodist Church, as it is now, not what it was before, if Trinity United Methodist Church disappears tomorrow, August 16th, 2021, what will the community of Montpelier, or enlarged Center Vermont, miss? That's the question. What will the community miss if the church is not here? This is not a test. This is totally anonymous, so don't write your name down. Or unless you want to. Yeah, it doesn't matter. But I'm going to share the results with everyone later on. And nor this is the only time I will ask this question. I'll plan to ask this question more frequently, the same question more frequently, hoping that our answer as a church will be clearer and closer to where we want to be. So we don't need to be anxious if our minds are going blank right now. And also don't feel pressure to satisfy the intent of this question. Because the goal of this exercise is to integrate who we say we are and who we actually are. That integrity. And the more we can answer this honestly, it'll be more helpful, I would say, especially as we navigate this post-pandemic world, because no one knows what it's going to look like exactly. So if your answer is, I don't know well enough about Trinity, what's going on in Trinity, we'll need to work on how to better communicate with the community to let them know what we do during the week. If your answer is nothing, we'll need to work on turning that answer into something, right? The point of the whole discourse about the bread of life, for me, the most important part for me is that transformative part, the transformation of our ordinary lives into something everlasting. The smell of fresh baked bread as we walk by the mangies, those breads organized neatly on the shelves of Shaw's, those everyday lives of ours. Perhaps too common that we take it for granted. God is promising that through Christ, our ordinary lives, our common lives will be transformed to something special, something everlasting, and something eternal. And that is the good news that we hear this morning. So, as you continue to answer that number 3, my question to you is, are you hungry enough? Are you hungry enough? Are you hungry for the bread of life this morning? I am, and I hope you are too. And I'm very thankful to God for giving me this faithful community who I can be hungry with. Amen. We're going to end our time of worship as we